Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very calm, very slow, and very strange. So go ahead and dim the lights. Lower the volume just enough that you can still hear me, but not enough that you feel obligated to stay awake. Get comfortable, because tonight we begin with a city that collectively forgot how to stop moving. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, which sounds fun. It was not. Now picture Strasbourg, 16th century, hot summer, no air conditioning, no iced drinks, just heat, stone streets, and vibes that could best be described as medieval burnout. People were tired, harvests had been bad, bread was expensive, diseases came and went like unwanted house guests, religion was everywhere, and joy was rationed. And in July of 1518, something quietly, awkwardly, and very inconveniently began. It started with one woman. Her name was Frau Trophea, which already sounds like someone history was going to bully. One morning, Frau Trophea walked into the street, and she began to dance. Not in a cheerful way, not with music, not even with enthusiasm. She just moved, slowly at first, then faster, arms flailing, feet pounding the stone. People watched because of course they did. At first it was amusing, strange but amusing, like seeing someone talk to themselves on a bus. But then she didn't stop. Hours passed. She kept dancing. Her husband tried to pull her inside. Didn't work. Neighbors tried to calm her down. Didn't work. Someone probably suggested she just relax, which has never helped anyone in the history of humanity. By nightfall, Frau Trophea collapsed from exhaustion, and then, the next day, she stood up and kept dancing. Now, at this point, Strasbourg had options. They could have intervened. They could have rested her. They could have said, okay, this seems medically concerning. They did none of that. Instead, they watched. Because medieval Europe had a very specific approach to unexplained behavior. Let's see where this goes. Within a few days, other people joined her. One, then two, then a handful, men, women, young, old. They danced, not together, not coordinated, just relentlessly. No smiles, no laughter, just grim, sweaty movement. And soon, the streets were full of people who could not stop dancing. Some cried while dancing. Some screamed. Some begged for help while dancing, which is a difficult request to take seriously, apparently. Now, let's pause for a second, because you might be imagining something whimsical, something folk dance adjacent. It wasn't that. This was not joy. This was not celebration. This was exhaustion wearing shoes. People danced until their feet bled. They danced until muscles seized. They danced until they collapsed, and sometimes did not get back up. And Strasbourg's leaders, the city council, finally decided to act, which is where this story becomes quietly, beautifully unhinged. Instead of stopping the dancing, they decided to encourage it. Yes, their reasoning was simple and wrong. They believed the dancers were afflicted by something spiritual, a curse. Specifically, they thought it was the work of Saint Vitus, a saint known for causing involuntary dancing when displeased, naturally. So their solution was, let them dance it out. Because of course you would. They hired musicians. They built a stage. They created what was essentially a municipally funded dance floor of doom. And the dancers danced, harder now, louder, longer, drums, fiddles, pipes. Nothing says mass psychological crisis like live entertainment. The city even encouraged healthy people to join in, because if dancing cured the curse, more dancing would obviously help. This did not help. Instead, more people joined. By August, accounts suggest dozens, possibly hundreds, were dancing. People died quietly from strokes, from heart attacks, from sheer physical collapse, and still the music played. At some point, and we'll never know exactly when, the city finally realized they may have misunderstood the situation. They shut down the musicians. They dismantled the stage. They banned dancing, which is a sentence no city ever expects to write. Instead, they tried something else. They took the dancers to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. They prayed. They sprinkled holy water. They performed rituals. Because when you don't understand something, ritual feels productive. Eventually, slowly, the dancing stopped, not all at once, not dramatically. People simply sat down, collapsed, slept, recovered, or didn't. And by late summer, the plague faded away. Strasbourg returned to normal, which is to say, hungry, stressed, religious, and deeply confused. Now here's the uncomfortable part. No one knows exactly why this happened. Historians have theories, of course. They always do. Some suggest ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations and spasms. Others point to mass psychogenic illness, collective stress manifesting physically. And honestly, that one feels uncomfortably modern. A population under pressure, fear, hunger, heat, no control over their lives. And suddenly, the body rebels, not with screams, not with riots, but with movement. Unstoppable, pointless movement, which feels relatable in ways we don't love. Now, the thing about the dancing plague isn't just the dancing, it's how everyone around it responded. No one panicked, no one rioted, they just tried things: music, prayer, authority, shrines. Each response was calm, measured, and deeply ineffective, and then it passed. Which might be the most unsettling part. No villain, no cure, no lesson, just a city that danced itself tired and went back to work. Now, before we drift onward, and we will slowly, let's sit with Frau Trofea again, the woman who started it all. She disappears from history shortly after. No record of her death, no recovery story, no explanation. She danced. She collapsed. She became a footnote, which is very on brand for history. In the next part, we'll float gently outward, away from Strasbourg, and look at other moments when entire populations behaved strangely, calmly, and disastrously, while everyone politely pretended this was fine. Because history is full of moments where no one screamed, they just coped badly. Because the dancing plague of 1518 was not an isolated lapse in human composure. It was simply one of many times humanity experienced a group meltdown, politely, without screaming, and with paperwork. And the thing about mass behavior like this is that it rarely looks dramatic in the moment. It looks administrative, concerned, calmly wrong. Let's drift back a bit. Medieval and early modern Europe was very good at one thing: living under constant stress while insisting this was normal. Famine, war, disease, religious guilt layered on top of religious guilt. People didn't have nervous breakdowns the way we imagine today. They didn't quit jobs or go to therapy. Their bodies simply found other outlets. Sometimes that outlet was dancing. Other times it was laughing. Which brings us to another extremely inconvenient phenomenon. In 1518, Strasbourg danced. In other centuries, people laughed. There are records, scattered, uncomfortable records, of laughing epidemics across Europe. Whole villages laughing uncontrollably. for days, sometimes weeks, not joyfully, not at jokes, just laughing, crying while laughing, begging to stop while laughing, which sounds exhausting. One of the most famous occurred in Tanganyika, modern day Tanzania, in 1962. A schoolgirl laughed, then another, then dozens. Soon, hundreds were affected. Schools shut down, villages closed. The laughter spread like gossip with legs. Doctors couldn't explain it, teachers couldn't stop it, parents just waited. Eventually, it faded. No punchline, no reason, just humans leaking stress through the mouth. Now, medieval Europe didn't call this psychology. They didn't have the language. They had saints and demons and vibes. Back then, unexplained behavior had to be external. It couldn't be the mind, because the mind was supposed to be obedient. So when bodies misbehaved, the blame went elsewhere: curses, possession, divine displeasure. Saint Vitus, in particular, was blamed for a lot. He became associated with spasms, convulsions, twitching, and dancing, which is a strange legacy for a saint. But here we are. People prayed to him to stop involuntary movements, or to cause them, depending on the day. Now imagine being a peasant in 1518. You're hungry, you're tired, you're deeply religious. Your neighbor starts dancing. You laugh at first, then another neighbor joins, then your cousin. At what point do you stop thinking, this is weird, and start thinking, this is happening? Probably sooner than we'd like to admit. Humans are very good at adaptation. We normalize chaos quickly, especially when everyone else seems to be doing it. And this is where Strasbourg's response becomes quietly fascinating. They didn't isolate the dancers, they didn't shut them away. They built a stage, they regulated the madness, they scheduled it, which tells us something important. They weren't panicking, they were managing. And management, historically, often looks like endorsement. Let's think about the musicians for a moment. Imagine being hired to play music for people who are dancing themselves toward cardiac failure. Imagine drumming gently as someone collapses and thinking, well, the council told us to. This is how disasters persist, not through malice, but through routine. Now, historians argue endlessly about what truly caused the dancing plague. Ergot poisoning is popular, it's dramatic, it involves fungus. Historians love fungus. Ergot can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and strange behavior. But there's a problem. Ergot doesn't usually cause synchronized behavior over weeks, and it doesn't politely affect entire neighborhoods. Mass psychogenic illness fits better, which is a calm way of saying people were overwhelmed, and their bodies found a shared language: movement. The medieval world did not offer emotional release. There was no space to say, I'm not okay. So instead, they danced until their legs quit. Now let's float to another group of elites who also responded to stress in deeply unhelpful ways: royal courts. Because if peasants danced, royals imploded quietly. They married cousins, they isolated themselves, they developed habits, strange ones. Kings who couldn't sleep without specific rituals, queens who refused to touch the ground, entire dynasties convinced they were chosen while clearly unraveling. And the courts normalized this because admitting instability was dangerous, so they called it divine, or eccentric, or just how the king is, which is how entire nations end up ruled by people who haven't had a good night's sleep since childhood. And this loops back to Strasbourg, because no one there stood up and said, this is not fine. They said, This is unfortunate, and carried on. The dancers were sick, but the city was stressed, and stress is contagious. That's the uncomfortable truth. Humans synchronize emotionally very easily. We mirror, we absorb, we follow. And when there's no outlet, the body improvises, sometimes with dancing, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with fainting. There were fainting epidemics too, by the way. Victorian England loved those. Entire rooms of women collapsing in sequence. Doctors blamed tight corsets, which sure, but stress was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Now, if you're listening to this while half asleep, there's something gently ironic here, because sleep itself is a kind of reset, a pressure release. The people of Strasbourg didn't get that. They lived in cycles of work, fear, and faith. So when the system overloaded, it leaked, and it leaked through feet. Now let's return briefly to the aftermath. After the dancing stopped, there was no investigation, no inquiry, no final report titled, "So About the Dancing." Life continued. Children were born, taxes were collected, some winters came. The event was recorded mostly by chroniclers who sounded confused but unfazed, which tells us this wasn't seen as unprecedented. Strange things happened. People accepted that. What mattered was that it ended, and that perhaps is the sleepiest part of all. History rarely resolves, it just moves on. In the next part, we'll drift into other quiet collapses, moments when entire populations behaved strangely, politely, and destructively, while leaders nodded thoughtfully and chose the wrong solution every single time. Because history is not a series of explosions, it's a series of misjudgments made calmly by tired people. Strasbourg has returned to its regularly scheduled medieval anxiety, and the dancers have stopped moving long enough for history to politely forget them. But the pattern we're following tonight isn't really about dancing. It's about what happens when people in charge feel obligated to do something, even when they have absolutely no idea what that something should be. Because humans, and especially authorities, are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. Silence feels like failure, inaction feels irresponsible, so instead, they act. And action, unfortunately, often makes things worse. Let's stay in the early modern world for a moment. Plagues were common, real ones, the kind with sores and death carts. Cities had systems for those: quarantines, lockdowns, prayer schedules. But when symptoms didn't fit the usual mold, when people weren't dying, just behaving oddly, that's when things got strange. Consider flagellant movements, groups of people who believed the world was ending, which it always was, according to someone, and decided the solution was to walk from town to town, whipping themselves, publicly, calmly, in unison. They believed physical pain could purge spiritual corruption, and crowds watched, sometimes joined, sometimes cheered. Authorities initially tolerated it, because again, doing nothing felt wrong. But eventually, these movements became disruptive, so they were banned, not because they were self-harming, that wasn't the concern, but because they challenged order, which is always the line. Now let's connect this back to Strasbourg. The dancing didn't challenge authority. It was inconvenient, yes. Messy, yes. But it didn't question power. So it was managed, not suppressed. Music instead of chains. Stages instead of prisons. A gentle, administrative madness. And that's a recurring theme. When odd behavior fits neatly into existing structures, it's tolerated When it doesn't, it's crushed. Now let's float over to medicine, or what passed for it. In 1518, doctors believed the dancing was caused by hot blood, which is one of those diagnoses that sounds impressive until you think about it. Hot blood. The solution? More movement, because obviously. They recommended controlled dancing, which is how you know no one was checking results. This wasn't cruelty, it was logic applied incorrectly, and that's often worse. The doctors meant well, they just didn't understand bodies the way we do now. They understood balance, humors, temperaments. Everything had to be equalized. Too much heat? Release it. Through motion, through sweat, through exhaustion. And exhaustion is exactly what they got. Now here's the part we don't talk about enough. Many of the dancers were women, which immediately shaped how the phenomenon was understood. Women's bodies, historically, were seen as unstable, susceptible, overly emotional. So when women danced, it confirmed biases. They were hysterical, weak, impressionable, which meant the explanation didn't need to go deeper. It was dismissed, even as people died. Men danced too, of course, but the narrative stuck, and narratives matter because they determine responses. Now imagine being a woman in Strasbourg. You're exhausted, you're hungry, you're under constant religious pressure. Your body starts moving without permission. You don't have language for anxiety. You don't have a diagnosis. You have a saint and a city watching you slowly fall apart. And instead of rest, they give you a stage. There's something quietly tragic about that. Now let's widen our view again. History is full of events that look absurd in hindsight but felt reasonable at the time. Bloodletting, trepanation, royal touch, healing scrofula. Kings believed their hands could cure disease, and people lined up. Because belief is powerful, expectation is powerful. And placebo, while very real, has limits, just like dancing. Now, the dancing plague didn't spread beyond Strasbourg in 1518. There were earlier outbreaks in the 14th and 15th centuries, but this was the last major one, which raises an interesting question. Why did it stop happening? Did people stop being stressed? No. Did food become plentiful? Also no. What changed was understanding, slowly, painfully. People began to see behavior as internal, psychological, not spiritual, not moral. And once you have language for something, it loses some of its power. Naming things is calming, even if the name doesn't fix it. Now, we're drifting towards something important here. The dancing plague feels distant, quaint, a medieval oddity, but the mechanism is not. We still experience mass stress responses. They just look different. Burnout, panic disorders, social contagions. They're quieter now, more individualized, but the pressure hasn't gone away. We've just learned to sit still through it, which honestly may not be healthier. Now let's gently return to the dancers one last time. There's a detail often overlooked. Some accounts mention that the dancers were taken to the shrine wearing red shoes. Red because St. Vitus liked red. Shoes because dancing. It's oddly tender. This attempt to help. Misguided, yes, but human. They were trying to restore order using the tools they had. Faith, ritual, structure, and eventually it worked. Not because of the shrine, but because time passed. And time is the most reliable cure history has. Now, as we settle deeper into the night, we're going to transition very gently into other strange, slow-moving disasters, not plagues of dancing, but plagues of inheritance, bloodlines stretched too thin, families repeating mistakes for centuries. Because while peasants danced under stress, royals married it, and the results were memorable. In the next part, we'll float into the quiet chaos of European dynasties, where emotional instability, physical fragility, and denial were passed down like heirlooms. Away from the streets of Strasbourg, away from exhausted bodies and unwanted movement, and we're going somewhere quieter. Palaces, which historically are just stress with better furniture, because while common people expressed pressure through collective behavior, royal families internalized it and then passed it on genetically, emotionally, ritually, over generations. Now, royalty had one job above all others: continue the bloodline. That was it. You could be cruel, you could be incompetent, you could be deeply unstable, but you had to reproduce, preferably with someone equally royal, preferably related. And this is where things begin to soften physically, mentally. The more exclusive the gene pool became, the more fragile the people inside it grew, and everyone pretended this was strength. Let's take a familiar example: the Habsburgs, a family so dedicated to keeping power in the family that they slowly turned into a case study. Their most famous feature was the jaw: long, protruding, determined, a jaw that suggested confidence and difficulty chewing. Charles II of Spain was the final result of generations of this strategy. He was called the Bewitched, which is medieval shorthand for "we don't want to talk about genetics." Charles could barely speak clearly. He struggled to walk. He had seizures. He was frequently ill. And yet, he was king because blood mattered more than ability. Now imagine growing up in that environment, everyone watching, everyone invested in your body performing correctly, every illness interpreted as a cosmic problem, every weakness magnified. There was no privacy, no rest, no permission to be ordinary. So the mind coped poorly. Many royals developed habits, obsessions, rituals, fixations. Some refused to bathe, others bathed obsessively. Some feared being poisoned, others feared being alone. And all of this was indulged because correcting the king was dangerous and questioning the dynasty was worse. Now let's pause here because this is important. The same mechanism that led Strasbourg to build a stage for dancers led courts to normalize instability. If behavior didn't threaten power, it was accepted, even reframed as divine. A king's mood swings became temperament. A queen's paranoia became piety. And so nothing was addressed, which is why dynasties collapsed slowly, not with explosions, but with sighs. Now consider Joanna of Castile, often called Joanna the Mad. She may not have been mad at all. She may have been grieving, depressed, angry. Her husband died. She mourned intensely, and that mourning was used against her. Her father and son declared her unfit to rule, and she spent decades confined because emotional expression in a woman was inconvenient. And again, the system absorbed it, declared it normal enough, just like Strasbourg. Now here's where the connection deepens. Royal courts were pressure cookers. No release, no escape. Every movement watched, every feeling politicized. So when royals cracked, they cracked inward. Delusions, hallucinations, breakdowns, and the court responded with structure, ceremony, routine, isolation, which often made things worse, but it looked orderly, and order is comforting. Now let's think about children. Royal children were not allowed to be children. They were assets. From birth, their lives were scheduled, marriages planned, alliances mapped, education rigid, affection optional. Many were raised by servants, their parents distant, which is an excellent way to produce emotionally stable adults. Of course, some grew withdrawn, others grew volatile, and all of it was excused as royal character. Now let's gently circle back to our theme. The dancing plague was visible, embarrassing, unavoidable. Royal dysfunction was private, elegant, hidden behind velvet. But both came from the same place, sustained pressure with no outlet, one expressed through bodies, the other through bloodlines, and both were managed, not healed, because healing requires understanding, and understanding was limited. Now imagine if Strasbourg had said, "These people need rest." Imagine if a court had said, "This child needs affection." History would look very different. But they didn't. They said, "This is how things are," and continued, which brings us to a very sleepy truth. Most historical disasters weren't caused by cruelty. They were caused by normalization, by people adapting to dysfunction instead of fixing it. In the next part, we'll continue drifting through the quiet wreckage, looking at specific royals whose lives became long, slow unravelings, not dramatic, not violent, just gently tragic. Kings who couldn't rule, queens who couldn't leave, children who never rested. Strasbourg has stopped dancing. The stages are gone. The musicians have been paid. The stones of the street are still warm, but empty, and Europe keeps going. That's the part history never lingers on long enough. The continuation, because the end of an event is rarely an end. It's just the moment people decide to stop paying attention. The dancing plague of 1518 didn't change laws. It didn't transform medicine overnight. It didn't lead to mass introspection. It became a story, something chroniclers wrote down with mild confusion and moved past. And that's exactly how most deeply human disasters are treated. They're noted, filed, then ignored. Now, if we look closely at what followed, not just in Strasbourg but across Europe, we don't see resolution. We see repetition. Stress didn't disappear. Poverty didn't lift. Faith didn't soften. People still lived short lives. Children still died young. Bodies still broke under pressure. What changed, slowly, almost invisibly, was interpretation. Over centuries, unexplained behavior moved categories, from curse to illness, from possession to disorder, from moral failing to something closer to understanding. But that transition was uneven, and for a long time, people lived in the overlap, where old explanations failed and new ones hadn't arrived yet. The dancing plague lives right there, in that uncomfortable middle. Now let's return one last time to the people themselves, not the event, the individuals. There were no heroes in Strasbourg, no villains either, just tired people, people who worked fields, people who carried water, people who lived under bells that marked time they didn't control. When the dancing began, they didn't revolt. They didn't demand answers. They adapted. They watched. They joined. They endured, which is something humans are exceptionally good at, enduring. And this is where the comparison with royalty quietly closes the circle, because while peasants endured physically, royals endured symbolically. Kings who should have stepped down didn't. Queens who should have rested weren't allowed to. Children who needed softness were raised as property, and everyone around them adjusted. Courts whispered, servants compensated, ministers worked around instability. Just like Strasbourg worked around the dancers, No one stopped the system. They made accommodations, and accommodations, when stretched long enough, become traditions. That's how dysfunction survives centuries. Now think about Charles II of Spain again, a man barely able to function, placed at the center of an empire. People knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what to do with that knowledge. So they prayed, they performed rituals, they blamed witchcraft, because admitting structural failure was unthinkable, just like admitting Strasbourg was overwhelmed. So when Charles died childless, triggering massive war, the reaction wasn't shock, it was inevitability. The same quiet acceptance that followed the dancing. Of course this happened. Of course it ended like this. History often reads like surprise, but lived history feels like slow confirmation. People sense collapse long before it arrives. They just keep moving, sometimes dancing, sometimes governing, sometimes marrying cousins, and all of it feels normal while it's happening. That's the most unsettling thing about the dancing plague. Not that people danced until they died, but that the city calmly enabled it, that musicians played, that doctors prescribed more movement, that no one screamed, "Stop," because no one knew how, and knowing how is rare, even now. Now, if we pull back far enough, farther than Strasbourg, farther than royal courts, what we're left with isn't a mystery, it's a pattern. Humans under sustained pressure will express it somehow. If the culture allows crying, they cry. If it allows anger, they rage. If it allows nothing, the body finds its own language. In 1518, that language was dance. Later, it was collapse, withdrawal, melancholy, and sometimes silence, which history loves. Because silence is easy to archive. The dancing plague survives because it was visible, because it spilled into the street. Most suffering doesn't. It stays contained, behind walls, behind crowns, behind routines. And that's why events like this feel unreal. They break the illusion that society is stable. They reveal how thin the surface really is. One hot summer, one stressed population, one woman who didn't stop moving. And suddenly, an entire city followed, then stopped, and went on. No lesson learned, no transformation completed. Just another layer added to the long story of humans adapting to things they should probably address. And that, quietly, is where this story ends. Not with resolution, but with continuation. Because Strasbourg kept existing, Europe kept ruling, people kept enduring, and history kept writing things down without always understanding them. The dancing stopped, the pressure didn't, and the world, as always, adjusted just enough to keep going. This is one of those stories that doesn't rush anywhere. It simply drifts. The kind of story that unrolls over decades, across drawing rooms, royal corridors, and polite society salons, where everyone is pretending not to notice something that is frankly extremely noticeable. So dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and allow history to do what it does best, lie to everyone for a very long time. Our story takes place in the 18th century, which was a wonderful time for powdered wigs, aggressive etiquette, and pretending things weren't happening when they very clearly were. People fainted easily. Medical science was mostly guessing, and if you wore the right clothes with enough confidence, society would simply nod and move on. This detail will become very important. Somewhere in this world of chandeliers and bad hygiene, a child appeared, or at least a person who was presented as a child, a young boy, delicate, quiet, well mannered. The kind of boy adults described as refined and frail, which in the 1700s was just code for this child is not going to survive the winter. Except this one did, and kept surviving and surviving for decades. From the outside, this boy seemed unusually reserved. He didn't roughhouse. He avoided physical activity. He preferred books, embroidery, music, and polite conversation. All of this was explained away as sensitivity, because of course it was. In aristocratic circles, sensitivity was practically a personality requirement, especially if you were wealthy enough that no one expected you to work, sweat, or lift anything heavier than a teacup. As the years passed, people noticed something else. The boy didn't change, at least not in the way boys usually did. He stayed small. His voice remained soft. His body never quite did what society expected it to do. This raised questions, but not too many, because asking questions in polite society is exhausting, and everyone preferred gossip whispered behind fans instead. Doctors were consulted, they always are, and as was tradition at the time, they confidently declared things they absolutely did not understand. The boy, they said, had a rare condition, a delicate constitution, a hormonal imbalance, something vague, something impressive sounding, something no one could disprove. Everyone nodded again, because doctors wore coats and spoke Latin, and that was usually enough. So the boy continued living as a boy. He was educated as one, presented to society as one, addressed as one, and over time he became middle aged, quietly, politely, without anyone officially acknowledging the extremely obvious math problem unfolding in front of them. By the time this boy was supposedly in his 20s, he looked unchanged. By his 30s, unchanged. By his 40s, still unchanged. And at some point, society simply stopped counting. Because if you don't count, you don't have to confront the fact that this young man had been young for about 40 years longer than nature usually allows. Now, here's where things get interesting in that slow, sleepy way history likes to do when it realizes it's been lying too hard. This was not a boy, never had been. This was a woman, a fully grown adult woman, one who had already lived half a century before most people even began to suspect anything was off. And no, she wasn't hiding in secret. She wasn't running from the law. She wasn't disguised in the dead of night. She was right there, in public, at court, at dinners, at events, smiling gently while everyone around her politely avoided the obvious. Her name, in some records, changes depending on who was doing the writing, because history itself didn't quite know what to do with her. But what we do know is this: she was born female, raised female in her earliest years, and at some point, her life took a sharp turn into quiet performance art that lasted decades. The reason? Inheritance, that's money, status, the usual trio of motivations that cause people to do extremely inconvenient things for extremely long periods of time. In the 18th century, being a man meant access. Being a woman meant waiting. Waiting for marriage. Waiting for permission. Waiting for a male relative to make decisions on your behalf. And in this particular family, the difference between son and daughter meant the difference between comfort and dependency. So the decision was made. Quietly, carefully, permanently. She would live as a boy. At first, this was easy. Children are flexible. Society is forgiving when you're young. But childhood ends. Bodies change. Except hers didn't. Or rather, changed in ways that could still be explained if everyone agreed not to look too closely. She learned the posture, the walk, the way to sit, the way to speak. Not loudly, not assertively, but gently enough to be dismissed as refined rather than suspicious. She learned when to withdraw, when to be ill, when to avoid situations that required physical proof of anything, and society helped her without realizing it, because society is very good at maintaining illusions that benefit everyone involved. As she aged, she became known as a sort of eternal youth, a strange curiosity. People remarked on it with mild amusement. He hasn't aged a day, they would say, which in hindsight should have set off alarms. But instead, it became part of the charm. There were whispers, of course. There are always whispers. But whispers don't become accusations unless someone wants them to, and no one wanted to. Because unraveling this story would have meant unraveling estates, titles, legal documents, and a lot of very uncomfortable dinner conversations. So instead, everyone chose sleep, metaphorical sleep, the kind where you see the problem and decide you're too tired to deal with it. As the decades rolled on, the boy became an old boy, still dressed the same, still spoken to the same way, still occupying a space that no longer made sense. Physicians continued to provide vague reassurances. Family members passed away. New generations arrived who had only ever known this person as him. And once a lie lasts long enough, it stops feeling like a lie and starts feeling like tradition. At around 50 years of age, the truth finally surfaced, not dramatically, not explosively, but with a quiet unraveling that matched the rest of her life. Documents emerged, confessions were made, or perhaps simply acknowledged. Accounts differ. History is tired like that. When the revelation came, it didn't cause outrage. It caused confusion, mild embarrassment, and then silence. Because what exactly do you do with the fact that an entire society participated in a shared illusion for half a century? You don't do much. You adjust the records. You soften the language. You let the person retreat from public life. You pretend it was all very complicated and best not discussed. And then you move on to the next scandal. What's most fascinating about this story isn't the disguise itself, it's the endurance, the patience, the way a single decision shaped an entire lifetime. Imagine waking up every day for decades knowing you cannot stop playing the role, not because you'll be punished, but because stopping would break something far larger than yourself. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't deception for thrill. It was survival, wrapped in etiquette and reinforced by everyone's collective exhaustion. And in the end, when history finally labels her correctly, it does so gently, almost apologetically, as if embarrassed it didn't notice sooner, as if hoping she won't mind. She lived her life between definitions, not celebrated, not condemned, simply endured, which honestly feels very on brand for the 18th century. And as we drift forward, leaving her quietly behind, we'll find that she was not alone. History is full of people like this, individuals shaped, bent, and quietly erased by systems that preferred convenience over truth. So let's keep floating, slowly, calmly, toward the next royal misunderstanding, the next dynastic mistake, the next human being politely trapped inside a role that never quite fit. By the time the boy reached what should have been a very alarming age, society had already made a decision. Not an official one, nothing written down, just a quiet, collective agreement that this situation was inconvenient, and therefore best handled by doing absolutely nothing about it. people noticed? Of course they noticed. You don't spend 40 years watching someone fail to age without at least raising an eyebrow. Servants noticed first. They always do. Servants see everything. They dress you. They undress you. They clean up after you. They know exactly how much nonsense is being performed in any given household. But servants also know when silence is safer, so they adjusted. They used vague language. They avoided pronouns when possible. They referred to the young master, even when the word young had become almost aggressively inaccurate. And because the household set the tone, everyone else followed. Visitors noticed next. Distant relatives, acquaintances, friends of friends. People would whisper after dinners. They would lean in and say things like, "Isn't it curious?" Or, "He's remarkably unchanged." Or the classic 18th century code phrase meaning something is deeply wrong here. "He's always been rather delicate." Doctors were brought in again, because if you say doctor, people relax, and doctors, bless them, were more than happy to provide explanations that sounded scientific enough to end conversations. Weak humors, imbalanced fluids, a constitution governed by melancholy, something about vapors, always vapors. And because medicine at the time was essentially astrology with better branding, no one could argue. So the boy remained a boy, officially, on paper, in inheritance records, in social introductions, in polite conversation where no one wanted to be the person who ruined dessert by pointing out the obvious. What's important here is that this wasn't one person tricking everyone else. This was everyone quietly agreeing to play along because the alternative was worse. The alternative meant lawsuits. It meant questioning wills. It meant property disputes. It meant admitting that for decades, everyone had been complicit. And that's a heavy thing to carry when all you really want is tea and predictable routines. So instead, society leaned into the illusion. The boy was excused from expectations. He didn't marry, which was explained away as fragility. He didn't produce heirs, which was explained away as fate. He didn't engage in masculine pursuits, which was explained away as taste. Every missing piece had a convenient excuse, and the excuses stacked up so neatly that no one bothered to knock them over. And the woman at the center of it all adapted. She learned how to disappear without leaving, how to be present without being examined, how to exist in rooms without becoming the focus of attention. She became agreeable, soft-spoken, mild, the kind of person people described as pleasant company and then promptly forgot about. This was not an accident. This was strategy, because visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites collapse. As years passed, the boy developed habits that further protected the illusion: frequent illness, extended periods of seclusion, travel that was announced but rarely verified, all completely normal for the elite of the time. In fact, almost expected. Illness, especially, was extremely useful. If you're unwell, no one expects explanations. They expect sympathy. They lower their voices. They stop asking questions. And in a century where everyone was vaguely unwell at all times, no one found it suspicious. She aged quietly, internally. Externally, she stayed frozen in a strange middle space. Not youthful enough to raise hope, not aged enough to raise alarms, just there. And then something subtle happened. People stopped waiting for change. At first, everyone assumed time would resolve the mystery. Puberty would arrive. Maturity would set in. Something would shift. And when it didn't, people waited longer, then longer still, until eventually the waiting turned into acceptance. This is one of history's favorite tricks. If something goes on long enough, it becomes normal. Not correct, not logical, and just normal. Children were born and grew up knowing this person only as he was. They had no memory of beginning, no reason to question the middle. To them, this was simply how things were. And once a generation accepts something as baseline reality, correcting it feels rude. Meanwhile, legal documents continued to pile up. Contracts, titles, records, all using the same name, the same gender, the same assumption. Changing it would have required admitting error, and institutions hate that more than anything. Eventually, the boy reached an age that could no longer be politely ignored. 50 years old, a miracle of youth, some said. A medical marvel, others suggested. But even miracles get tiring when they go on too long. The truth began to leak, not because someone exposed it, but because the effort to maintain it became exhausting. People slipped, language softened, descriptions grew vague. Someone said they instead of he. Someone else paused too long before speaking. And finally, quietly, the truth emerged. Not shouted, not announced, just acknowledged. There was no scandal, no trial, no public humiliation. Because again, that would have required everyone to admit they had helped sustain the illusion. Instead, the revelation was handled the same way the lie had been, gently, indirectly, and with a strong preference for moving on. Records were amended, or quietly ignored. The woman was allowed to withdraw from public life, to exist, finally, without performance, without pretending to be frozen in time. History, of course, struggled to categorize her. Writers didn't know where to place her story. She didn't fit neatly into heroic disguise narratives or scandalous deception tales. She wasn't defiant enough. She wasn't dramatic enough. She was practical. And that makes her story oddly uncomfortable, because it shows how easily identity can be reshaped by necessity, how willingly society participates when the arrangement benefits everyone involved. As we drift away from her life, we start to see a pattern forming. She was not unique. She was just unusually patient. The centuries are full of people quietly bent out of shape by inheritance laws, gender expectations, and dynastic pressure, royals especially, elites trapped inside systems that valued bloodlines over bodies, appearances over truth. And so, slowly, gently, we float onward toward more lives lived in contradiction, more people shaped into roles they never chose, more stories where the strangest part isn't the deception, but how comfortable everyone became with it. After the truth surfaced, quietly, politely, and without anyone raising their voice, the world did what it always does when faced with something awkward. It adjusted its posture, cleared its throat, and pretended this was all very reasonable. The woman at the center of the story did not suddenly become famous. There were no pamphlets, no salacious memoirs, no public reckoning. Instead, she slipped into a kind of historical half-light, not erased, just gently blurred, which honestly matched the tone of her entire life. She had spent decades being seen without being examined, and now, finally, she was examined without being truly seen. What happens after you stop pretending for 50 years is not a triumphant reveal. It's fatigue, deep, quiet fatigue, the kind that settles into your bones and asks very little of the future. She withdrew from society, as many inconvenient people do, not dramatically, no exile, just fewer appearances, fewer invitations, a gradual fading into private rooms and controlled company. And society let her go without protest, because society had already taken what it needed from her. Had been secured, estates had passed hands, legal lines had been preserved. The system had gotten what it wanted, and once systems are satisfied, they lose interest remarkably fast. What remained was a person who had lived almost an entire lifetime as a solution to a problem she did not create. Historians, centuries later, struggled with her story. Some framed it as deception, others as tragedy. A few tried to romanticize it, which feels ambitious, because there is nothing especially romantic about spending 50 years avoiding mirrors, questions, and honest introductions. There is no evidence she enjoyed the performance, no letters describing thrill or rebellion, no dramatic confessions, just survival. Careful, sustained survival. And that's perhaps the most unsettling part. This wasn't an act of bold defiance against gender norms. It was compliance, adaptation, a life spent fitting into the smallest possible space to keep everything else from collapsing. The 18th century was full of these quiet compromises, especially among the elite, especially among women. Their lives were often shaped less by who they were than by what their families needed them to be at very specific moments. And once those moments passed, the shape stayed. It's tempting to imagine what her private thoughts might have been. Did she think of herself as a woman living as a man? Or did the performance eventually blur into identity? After decades of repetition, roles have a way of settling in. The body remembers routines even when the mind grows tired of them. We don't know. History rarely records interior lives unless someone makes a lot of noise about them. And she never did. Instead, she left behind traces, court records that suddenly grow vague, descriptions that shift tone, references to unusual circumstances, and peculiar arrangements. The kind of language institutions use when they're hoping future generations won't ask follow-up questions. But of course, we do, because her story opens a door to something much larger. Not just gender, but the way power structures quietly recruit individuals to hold themselves together. How laws, traditions, and expectations lean on real bodies to maintain abstract ideas like lineage and legitimacy. She was a patch in the system, a human workaround. And once you notice that, you start seeing similar patterns everywhere. Royal daughters married off to secure alliances they would never benefit from. Sickly sons propped up as heirs long after it was clear they couldn't rule. Children molded into symbols before they could form opinions. Entire lives arranged around the appearance of continuity. The elites loved continuity. They feared disruption, and they were willing to bend people into uncomfortable shapes to avoid it. Which brings us, gently, to a broader realization. This story is not strange because one woman lived as a boy for 50 years. It's strange because it worked, because everyone involved found it easier to maintain the illusion than to confront the truth, and that should feel familiar. Because history is full of these quiet agreements, these collective silences, these moments where everyone knows, but no one says, not because they're cruel, but because they're tired, or invested, or benefiting just enough to keep quiet. As we drift onward, we'll encounter more figures like her, some royal, some noble, some tucked away in footnotes, all shaped by expectations that ask them to disappear into roles rather than exist as people. By the time her life finally came to an end, There was no announcement that matched the effort it had taken to live it. No correction issued to the world, no formal reckoning, just a quiet death, recorded in the same restrained language that had followed her for decades. The documents were careful. They always are at moments like this. Names were listed, dates approximated, descriptions softened. The person who had lived half a century as a boy and died as a woman was absorbed into the archive with minimal disruption. History, after all, prefers smooth edges. And just like that, the problem resolved itself. There was no longer a need to maintain the illusion, no more polite evasions, no more explanations involving delicate constitutions and mysterious ailments. The system could finally exhale, satisfied that the inconvenience had passed without incident. What remained was a story that didn't quite know where to sit. She wasn't celebrated because celebration invites questions. She wasn't condemned because condemnation would have required admitting fault. Instead, she became something far more common in historical records, an oddity briefly noted, then set aside. Later, historians would stumble across her case and pause. Some would raise eyebrows. Others would rush to categorize her using modern language that didn't quite fit. A few would reduce her life to a curiosity, a strange anecdote, a did you know moment. But none of those framings quite capture what actually happened. This wasn't a trick played on society. It was a compromise made with it. Her family gained stability. The estate stayed intact. Legal continuity was preserved. The machinery of inheritance rolled on without interruption. And in return, one person agreed, explicitly or implicitly, to disappear into a role that was never meant to be temporary. And this is where the story quietly closes in on its most uncomfortable truth. No one forced the illusion to continue for 50 years. It persisted because it worked, because it was useful, because everyone involved found reasons to keep it alive. Some out of self-interest, some out of convenience, some out of exhaustion. That kind of cooperation doesn't happen accidentally. It reveals something deeply human about power structures. They don't just impose themselves through violence or decree. They persist through accommodation, through people making small adjustments that slowly harden into lifelong commitments. She adjusted, society adjusted around her, and eventually the arrangement felt permanent. In the end, she left behind no school of thought, no movement, no challenge to the system that shaped her. Her life did not dismantle the rules that confined it. It simply demonstrated how adaptable those rules could be when they needed to be, and that may be the most unsettling legacy of all, because it reminds us that history isn't always driven by grand confrontations. Sometimes it moves forward on quiet agreements, on shared silences, on people deciding day after day that today is not the day to ask difficult questions. Her life didn't end with revelation, it ended with absorption. She was folded back into the narrative, smoothed over, and eventually filed away. And for centuries, that was enough. But if we pause long enough, and history rewards those who pause, we can see her story not as a strange exception, but as part of a pattern of individuals quietly reshaped to preserve systems larger than themselves. Royals did this constantly, nobles too. They sacrificed comfort, identity, and autonomy in exchange for stability and legitimacy. Some were aware of the bargain, others inherited it before they could object. She simply lived the bargain longer than most. And so, As this story gently comes to rest, it doesn't offer a lesson or a moral. History rarely does. It offers instead a moment of stillness, a reminder that behind the titles, the estates, and the carefully maintained records were real people making real compromises, often without applause or acknowledgement. Her name may fade, her details may blur, but the shape of her life remains familiar. A life lived not for self expression, not for rebellion, but for continuity. And in that quiet endurance, she becomes less of a mystery and more of a mirror, intentionally. It is about patience taken to an extreme, commitment stretched across decades, and a group of monks who looked at the normal idea of death and thought, we could really overcomplicate this. So settle in, let your breathing slow, nothing dramatic is about to happen quickly. In fact, almost nothing in this story happens quickly at all. That's kind of the point. In the mountains of northern Japan, centuries ago, certain Buddhist monks followed a path so long and so methodical that it barely feels real from a modern perspective. These monks were not interested in wealth, fame, or even comfort. They were interested in control, control over the body, control over desire, control over decay itself, and eventually control over what happened after death. This practice came to be known as Sokushin Butsu, which roughly translates to becoming a Buddha in this very body, not spiritually, not metaphorically, physically, as in the body stays behind, intact, on display, sitting calmly forever. And yes, it took years, decades actually, because of course it did. The monks who attempted Sokushin Butsu believed that enlightenment did not have to wait until death. If the body could be purified completely, emptied of all fat, moisture, and decay, then the monk could transcend mortality while technically still being present. This idea did not come out of nowhere. It developed within Shingon Buddhism, a sect founded in the early 9th century by a monk named Kukai, later known as Kobo Daishi. He was one of those historical figures who become so revered that people eventually stop questioning anything associated with him, which is usually how things escalate. Kukai taught that enlightenment could be achieved through intense discipline, ritual, and physical endurance. Over time, some of his followers interpreted this very, very literally, and slowly, quietly, a tradition emerged in which monks attempted to transform themselves into living relics, not quickly, not dramatically, but step by step, year by year, one very bland meal at a time. The process usually began when a monk decided, often in middle age, that this would be his life's final project. There was no ceremony announcing it, no dramatic speech, just a decision, a calm one, possibly over a bowl of roots. The first phase lasted about 1,000 days, roughly 3 years. During this time, the monk followed a strict diet known as mokujikigyo. This meant eating only nuts, seeds, berries, and roots found in the mountains. No rice, no grains, no comfort food of any kind. Just forest debris, really. The goal was simple: lose all body fat. Fat decays. Fat smells. Fat ruins the whole eternal serenity aesthetic. Alongside this diet, the monk maintained intense physical activity, long walks, meditation, manual labor. The idea was to burn every last reserve of energy the body had. By the end of this phase, the monk would be thin, extremely thin, quiet, focused, and probably very tired, but spiritually motivated enough to ignore that. After the first 1,000 days, the monk did not celebrate, because that would be inappropriate. Instead, he moved directly into the second 1,000 days. This phase was even more restrictive. The diet narrowed further: pine bark, roots, needles, things that technically counted as edible if you were committed enough. The monk consumed almost no calories, continuing to strip the body of anything that could rot later. By this point, the monk's appearance had changed dramatically. Cheeks hollowed, skin tightened. The body began to resemble something already halfway removed from ordinary human life, which again was the goal. Throughout this process, the monk continued chanting, meditating, and performing rituals. This wasn't framed as suffering, it was framed as purification, which is one of those words that can mean almost anything if you repeat it calmly enough. After roughly 6 years of preparation, the monk entered the final stage. This is where things became especially specific. The monk began drinking a tea made from the sap of the urushi tree, also known as the lacquer tree. This sap is toxic. In normal circumstances, it causes vomiting and organ distress, which in this case was intentional. The idea was that the poison would drive out remaining fluids and kill bacteria in the body. It would also make the monk's body toxic to insects, because nothing ruins eternal preservation like bugs. At this point, the monk was not expected to survive for long, but survival was not really the objective anymore. Completion was. When the monk felt the time had come, he entered a small stone chamber just large enough to sit in the lotus position. Inside was a bell and an air tube leading to the outside. The monk was sealed inside while still alive. Every day he rang the bell. This was the signal that he was still meditating, still breathing, still present. One day the bell stopped. When that happened, the air tube was removed. The chamber was sealed completely, and everyone waited quietly, respectfully, for 3 years. After those 3 years, the chamber was opened. If the body had decayed, the attempt was considered unsuccessful. The monk was still respected, still buried properly, but not recognized as a Sokushin Butsu. Enlightenment apparently had standards. But if the body remained preserved, naturally mummified through discipline alone, then the monk was declared a living Buddha. The body was cleaned, dressed in robes, and placed in a temple for veneration. No drama, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement that someone had committed very hard to a very specific idea. Only about 24 monks are known to have successfully achieved Sokushin Butsu. Many more tried. Most did not succeed, which is another reminder that this was not a guaranteed outcome, no matter how disciplined you were. These monks became local religious figures. People came to pray before them, to leave offerings, to sit quietly in their presence, whilst the monks remained seated, eyes closed, expression calm, as if still meditating, which, depending on your perspective, they were. It's important to understand that this practice was not seen as morbid within its cultural and religious context. It was not about death, it was about transcendence. The body was treated not as something to escape, but something to perfect, slowly, painfully, politely. Over time, however, attitudes changed. By the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, Japan began modernizing rapidly. Western medical ideas gained influence, and self-mummification started to look less like enlightenment and more like a legal problem. In 1879, the Japanese government officially banned the practice, not retroactively, of course. The already mummified monks stayed where they were, still seated, still calm, still unbothered by bureaucracy. Today, several Sokushin Butsu remain on display in temples, particularly in the Yamagata region. They sit quietly, surrounded by incense and soft light while visitors pass through. Some people feel awe, some feel discomfort, most feel a vague sense of, well, that's commitment. And that's really the theme here. Commitment taken to a level that no productivity book has ever dared suggest. No shortcuts, no hacks, just decades of saying no to comfort and yes to pine needles. As we continue, we'll drift deeper into the lives of individual monks, the ones whose names we remember, the ones who failed quietly, and the strange legacy they left behind. A reminder that history is full of people who looked at normal limits and calmly stepped far beyond them without ever raising their voice. The everyday existence of the monks who undertook Sokushin Butsu. Because, as with all historical extremes, it's often the small, quiet details that are the most fascinating. Before a monk even began the first 1,000 days of strict dietary restriction, he would usually retreat into a monastery or a remote temple. These were not places of hustle or noise. They were stone, wood, and paper screens. They were the kind of places where the sound of a single footstep echoed like a small drum, perfect for people preparing to sit in silence for decades. The monks' daily routines were, well, predictable, and predictability was key. Wake, meditate, walk, eat a handful of roots, chant, repeat. The mind had to be trained as much as the body. Every movement, every breath, every morsel of food was a step toward ultimate control. Some monks were said to develop incredibly sharp mental focus during these years. Not in a superhuman sense exactly, but in the quiet, obsessive way that people who measure every grain of rice develop. They could sit for hours, even days, in meditation without shifting. They memorized scriptures, they analyzed their own bodily processes, and crucially, they learned to accept gradual decline, because make no mistake, the body was gradually declining. Fat disappeared, muscle diminished, skin loosened, strength ebbed away. Friends and fellow monks watched, if they were present, as a human slowly became something more like a statue than a living person. During the second 1,000 days, the pine needle's bark and toxic sap phase, physical discomfort was extreme, though the monks rarely complained. Pain was reframed as refinement. Hunger became meditation. Nausea was a sign that the body was following instructions. Some monks reportedly sang or chanted mantras to cope. Others simply stared at the wall, counting breaths or silently reciting sutras. One can imagine these days passing with almost imperceptible differences between one and the next. And perhaps that was exactly what was intended. A life condensed into the rhythm of waiting, waiting, and waiting some more. In addition to controlling the body, monks had to control their relationships. Family, friends, even fellow monks were often left behind or distanced. Emotional attachments could disrupt the detachment necessary for the final phase. Letters were rarely sent. Visitors were uncommon. Occasionally, a local villager might bring fresh roots or water, but even that contact was minimal. This is one of the quieter, subtler aspects of the practice: loneliness, extreme isolation in the service of ultimate calm. And unlike most forms of extreme asceticism that have dramatic or theatrical elements, Sokushin Butsu remained almost entirely private. No crowds, no public demonstrations, just decades of incremental change. Interestingly, monks were also surprisingly meticulous about record keeping, at least in some cases. Some temples kept logs of who had attempted the practice, what diet was followed, and when the final entombment occurred. This attention to detail reflected a fundamental belief. Every step mattered. Every decision in life, even in death, could contribute to success or failure. Failure, however, was quietly tragic, not in the way of a dramatic fall, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible way a life does not go according to plan. If a monk's body decayed after burial, if insects or mold invaded, the attempt was considered unsuccessful. These monks were still respected, still buried, but the ultimate goal had slipped away. Those who succeeded, however, entered a very different kind of quiet legacy. The mummified monks were placed in temples, sometimes within glass cases, sometimes simply seated behind lattice screens. They became objects of veneration. People came to pray, leave offerings, and sit in contemplative silence near them. And the irony, of course, is gentle but sharp. The monk's goal was to transcend mortality, yet their presence, sitting calmly for centuries, reminded every visitor of mortality in the quietest, slowest way possible. They did not scream, they did not shake, they did not lecture. They just existed, frozen yet somehow alive in ritualized stillness. Some temples even included small inscriptions noting the monk's life, the number of years of preparation, and the date of final sealing. This added to the impression that the monks had achieved something measurable, precise, almost bureaucratic in its exactness. Decades of effort condensed into a single seated figure, eyes closed, breathing long gone but presence somehow lingering. A few modern researchers have studied these monks with a mix of fascination and discomfort. The chemical composition of the body, the exact methods of preservation, and the psychological states required have all been analyzed. And while we can describe the process step by step, the lived experience remains almost impossible to imagine. Decades of self-denial, precision, and absolute patience, all in service of being perfectly still after death. Yet for the monks themselves, it seems to have been a natural choice, a rational progression of a life spent in discipline. In some ways, it was not dramatic or shocking at all, at least not from their perspective. It was simply the continuation of the same meditation, labor, and attention to the body that had defined their earlier years. As we float further into the story, it's worth noting that this was not a widespread practice. Even in northern Japan, Sokushinbutsu was extremely rare. Only a small subset of monks ever attempted it, and fewer still succeeded, which makes the surviving examples all the more remarkable if measured by quiet patience and methodical effort. These monks' lives also contrast sharply with the rest of history. While kings, generals, and rulers were busy plotting wars, engaging in intrigue, or chasing wealth, these monks were focused on what might appear trivial to an outsider. What happens if the body is left perfectly still, perfectly controlled, for decades? And yet, in their own way, they were ambitious. Not ambitious in the common sense of fame or power, but in the more subtle sense of attempting a feat almost impossible to achieve, mastering the most intimate and uncontrollable of things, the human body, and leaving it behind as a testament to self-discipline. Some monks even left notes or instructions for future generations: how to sit, how to meditate, how to endure. These instructions were not theatrical. They were quiet, practical, slow, almost boring if one were listening casually, yet containing the weight of centuries of experience. As we drift to the next layer of the story, we'll explore the rituals surrounding the entombment itself. The last days before the monk's final sealing, the ceremonies performed by fellow monks, and the careful attention given to the chamber. All of it done with the same calm, measured precision that defined the monks' entire lives. This is a story not of excitement, but of extreme patience, not of adventure, but of endurance, not of drama, but of quiet mastery. And it's exactly this slow, inexorable quality that allows us to appreciate just how unusual these monks truly were. Now we arrive at the final phase of Sokushin Butsu, where decades of preparation converge into a single, silent act. The monk enters the small stone chamber for the last time, sits in lotus position, and prepares for the ultimate stillness. The chamber is narrow, just enough space to accommodate a seated figure. There is a small air tube allowing breathing during the first days. A bell is placed within reach. The bell is not for theatrics. It is a quiet signal that the monk is still alive. Each day, the monk rings the bell, one gentle, monotonous chime after another. Visitors are rare but permitted. Fellow monks or disciples may come to check, to leave small offerings, or to whisper prayers. But contact is minimal. Every sound, every motion is measured and intentional. Then, inevitably, the bell stops. And with that cessation comes the final step. The air tube is removed, and the chamber is sealed completely. From that point onward, the monk remains in isolation, encased in silence and stone, for 3 years. 3 years during which decay is prevented only by the years of preparation, diet, and ritual. When the chamber is reopened, the results are observed. If decay has occurred, the attempt is considered unsuccessful. The body may be respectfully buried, and the effort noted, but the monk is not recognized as a full Sokushin Butsu. Success, however, is quiet, methodical, and deliberate. The preserved body is cleaned and dressed in robes, often seated on display in a temple. The monk's expression remains calm, serene, almost meditative, eyes closed, as if still engaged in the practice that defined his life. These figures, frozen yet strikingly lifelike, became objects of reverence. Worshippers would come to pray, leave offerings, and sit in contemplative silence. The monks were venerated as spiritual exemplars, demonstrating a mastery over the body and desire that few could imagine. The practice, while extreme, was considered a pure path to enlightenment. Death was not the enemy, it was the medium. In examining the legacy of these self-mummified monks, the human and cultural significance is as quiet as the practice itself. They exist as a paradox, lifeless yet alive in ritual, removed from the chaos of everyday existence, yet present in the minds of those who visit them. They are simultaneously a testament to devotion, an artifact of endurance, and a reminder that historical extremes often lie in patience and precision rather than spectacle. The monks' meticulous methods, the years of self-denial, and the strict discipline required to achieve preservation make them unique even among other ascetic traditions. Unlike dramatic or violent attempts at spiritual mastery, Sokushin Butsu relied on constancy, control, and incremental progression. The practice is historically rare, yet several examples remain today, particularly in the mountains of Yamagata. Visitors encountering these mummies may feel reverence, curiosity, or discomfort, but almost universally, they sense the quiet discipline encoded in each posture, each folded hand, each closed eye. It is worth noting that while the Meiji government officially banned the practice in the late 19th century, the monks who had completed the ritual remained undisturbed. Their presence continues to influence Buddhist thought, regional history, and even anthropological study. Researchers have investigated chemical composition, preservation methods, and cultural context, yet the lived experience, the patient incremental journey of decades, is nearly impossible to convey fully. These monks embody a slow mastery over human limitation. They remind us that history is not only composed of kings, battles, and dramatic events, but also of individuals quietly pursuing extremes of patience and discipline. Through them, we see devotion measured not in hours, months, or even years, but in decades of methodical effort, attention, and endurance. And so, the Sokushin Butsu stand as both historical curiosity and spiritual statement. Preserved in meditation, they illustrate a path that defies ordinary understanding. Their silent presence endures across centuries, offering subtle lessons about control, perseverance, and the quiet, often overlooked dimensions of human ambition. No fanfare accompanies their story, no dramatic flourish concludes it. The monks' lives and deaths remain an extended, measured exhale. The chambers are opened, eyes are observed, offerings are placed, visitors come and go, time passes, and the mummies, seated and calm, continue their eternal meditation. In the end, the story of the self mummified monks of Japan is not a tale of spectacle or terror. It is the story of patience stretched across decades, of control over the physical self taken to the ultimate extreme, and of a quiet, enduring presence that continues to exist centuries later. Their existence is subtle, slow, methodical, and perhaps, in its own way, utterly complete. It's early 19th century London. The city is bustling, gray, and damp, which, if you're not familiar with London weather, is basically every day. Horse-drawn carts clatter over cobblestones, people shout over each other in markets, and somewhere nearby, a kettle is boiling for the umpteenth time. In the midst of this perfectly ordinary chaos, something extraordinarily strange is about to happen, or perhaps extraordinarily boring, depending on how you feel about rivers of beer. So picture this: London, 1814. You have the Moo and Company Brewery, one of those large industrial-scale beer operations. Not just any beer operation, but a giant hulking factory devoted entirely to ale. And in this factory, there were enormous vats. Enormous like, maybe you could hide a small cottage inside. Enormous. They were designed to store something like 3,500 barrels of porter, which is basically a very dark, very strong beer. And just to give you a sense of scale, that's roughly enough liquid to drown a small village, if you were that sort of person. But of course, no one was thinking about that. No, everyone was just focused on making beer. Now these vats were made of wood, bound with iron hoops, the kind of construction that is perfectly fine as long as the wood doesn't swell, rot, or, start to leak. But in March of 1814, the temperature in London was a bit variable, cold at night, slightly warmer during the day, which in terms of structural engineering is basically a polite way of saying these vats were going to fail spectacularly, and fail they did. One of the largest vats, containing somewhere around 1.5 million liters of porter, burst. When it burst, the beer didn't just gently spill out. It wasn't a calm trickle. Oh no, it was more of a tidal wave. And this tidal wave of beer, for reasons that nobody thought were important until it happened, surged through the brewery and spilled out into the streets of the St. Giles neighborhood, which, in 1814, was a fairly densely populated area, mostly with houses that were poorly maintained because, well, London. Now imagine standing on a quiet street, perhaps holding a basket of vegetables or walking with a small child, and suddenly realizing that you are in the path of a moving, gushing river of beer. That is the kind of absurdity that Londoners of the time experienced. There are reports of people being trapped, furniture being swept away, and in some cases, entire rooms flooding. If you were a cat or someone who enjoyed dry socks, this was a very inconvenient event. The flood didn't stop at the brewery. Beer, in its infinite commitment to chaos, spilled into nearby homes, basements, and cellars. It broke down walls, toppled fences, and created a sticky, foamy mess that no one really knew how to clean up. Firemen, who were busy elsewhere, were called in, but their water hoses did little to stop the tide. It's worth noting here that the concept of beer insurance didn't exist, which, if you ask me, seems like a glaring oversight. In total, the flood caused at least 8 deaths, though some sources speculate it may have been more. People drowned in beer. Not drowning in a pool or a river, but literally drowned in porter, which is mildly terrifying if you think about it. Furniture, personal belongings, and pets were swept along for the ride. And yet, despite all this, it was also strangely mundane, because no one was armed, no one was fighting, and no one was particularly heroic. It was just beer, flowing in very large quantities. The aftermath was, in its own way, also uneventful. The brewery faced lawsuits, mostly from people whose houses had been damaged, and Moo and Company, in a true sign of corporate resilience, rebuilt the vat. They may have even done so with a slightly better design, though records are not entirely clear. What is clear is that the London beer flood became a minor footnote in the city's long history of odd disasters. It is remembered now mostly as a story to tell when you want to seem like you know something slightly ridiculous about history. But let's float over to another detail that makes this story a bit more interesting, or at least mildly so. The flood occurred in the St. Giles neighborhood, which at the time was considered a poor and overcrowded district, which meant that, ironically, the very people least able to afford sudden floods were the ones who got the largest, most unexpected beer baths. You can imagine landlords pacing their rooms, sighing deeply, and thinking about taxes, repairs, and perhaps whether porter could be used as some sort of accidental income. Spoiler, it could not. And the beer itself, much of it was lost forever, which is a tragedy in its own quiet way. Consider the cost of producing 1.5 million liters of porter, the fermentation, the barrels, the manpower, all gone, spilled into the streets, absorbed by dirt, and evaporated in the damp London air. Some historians note that the smell lingered for days, a mixture of malt, yeast, and general urban grime. Perfect for taking a walk if you were a connoisseur of unusual aromas. Not so great if you had allergies or just wanted fresh air. The event also inspired a small amount of artistic and literary attention. Satirical prints of the time depicted people floating in barrels, clinging to furniture, and being carried along like tiny boats in a sticky brown river. It was a source of dry amusement for some, and for others, an unpleasant reality check about the limits of industrial storage. And so, in summary, the London beer flood of 1814 is not remembered for heroism or drama or the kind of action packed chaos you might see in a movie. It is remembered for being absurd, mundane, sticky, and in a very specific sense, tragic. People died, beer was lost, and Londoners went about their business the next day, as they always did, because that is what you do in London. Life goes on with minor disasters, damp weather, and the occasional river of beer. So after the beer had done its work, leaving behind a mixture of foam, broken barrels, and soggy furniture, the residents of St. Giles had to deal with the aftermath. And by deal, I mean slowly, quietly, and with a sense of resigned disbelief. Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside, and finding your street coated in brown liquid. That's a Tuesday in March, apparently. People salvaged what they could. Some had wooden furniture floating like tiny rafts. Others had walls soaked to the studs. There were reports of mattresses that could no longer support a human because, in a cruel twist of physics, they had absorbed approximately 500 liters of porter each. And yes, in some cases, the porter had fermented further, producing an aroma that combined sourness, sweetness, and the kind of yeasty smell that makes you question why humans invented brewing in the first place. Landlords, of course, were annoyed. They had to pay for repairs, which were not cheap, and yet somehow they also had to listen to tenants complain about being soaked in beer. A few of the more imaginative ones considered bottling the mess and selling it as vintage flood porter, but that idea didn't catch on. I imagine the thought process went like this: people want beer, but not beer soaked floors. Thank you very much. Now, let's meander slowly into the legal fallout, which is where the story becomes a quiet, bureaucratic kind of drama. Several residents sued Moo and Company for damages, claiming that the brewery's vats were negligently maintained. The case made its way through the courts, though nothing revolutionary happened in legal history, because, as you might imagine, law in 1814 London was designed to move at a pace that encourages napping. The lawsuits eventually resulted in some modest compensation for victims, though the details are murky. Some sources suggest that the brewery paid a few £100s to those whose homes were ruined, which, when you convert to modern money, is significant, but not enough to rebuild an entire neighborhood. It was enough, however, to remind Moo and Company that industrial beer storage carries risks beyond the ordinary sticky fingers of Londoners in taverns. Meanwhile, the press had a field day in a very polite Victorian sort of way. Satirical prints and small pamphlets circulated depicting people being carried along in barrels, clinging to furniture, and floating helplessly in rivers of ale. One cartoon shows a small child waving from a bathtub-like vessel surrounded by an absurdly cheerful flood. It's worth noting here that humor in 1814 was subtler than modern memes. People didn't laugh loudly. They smirked quietly, perhaps while sipping their tea and thinking about how their neighbors were very unlucky. Another interesting detail is that the flood indirectly highlighted the precarious living conditions in St. Giles. The district was overcrowded, homes were poorly constructed, and sanitation was already questionable. The beer flood, in its quiet absurdity, revealed vulnerabilities that residents had mostly ignored. It's a minor tragedy, yes, but also a commentary on early industrial London. Accidents like this were rarely heroic or dramatic. They were bureaucratic, sticky, and mildly inconvenient. Perfect fodder for sleepy history narration. Moo and Company, for its part, rebuilt the broken vat. And in true industrial fashion, they kept brewing. Perhaps with slightly improved structural integrity, perhaps with the same reckless optimism that allowed them to store millions of liters of fermenting porter in wooden barrels bound by iron hoops. One imagines engineers pacing slowly, rubbing their chins and whispering, "Maybe we should check this annually," which of course is exactly the kind of caution that might slow down profit. Let's drift for a moment into the human side. Imagine living in St. Giles that week. Families woke up, surveyed the damage, and went about life with mild resentment toward fate. Some households were ruined, but most people were alive, which is a small comfort. And some people even found humor, quietly, in the absurdity of it all. A barrel floating down the street, carrying a man's breakfast table along with him, has a certain visual poetry if you look at it from the right angle. Not exciting poetry, just slow, gentle poetry. It's also worth noting that the flood, while tragic for a few, became a sort of legend over time. Scholars and curious Londoners would recount it as the time London literally drowned in beer, which is a story that, if you say it calmly and slowly, works perfectly as a bedtime anecdote. Imagine your history teacher reading this aloud at 8 p.m., and suddenly the classroom is full of yawns and soft snoring. That's exactly the energy this story carries. Socially, the event had limited long term impact. The brewery remained in business, the neighborhood rebuilt, and London continued to produce beer in copious quantities. But culturally, it became a quiet reminder that industrialization is messy, accidents happen, and sometimes that mess comes in liquid form. People lost possessions, and a few lost their lives, but the river of beer flowed on, leaving behind a tale that is odd, tragic in a mild sense, and perfectly suited for slow, reflective narration. In conclusion, the London beer flood of 1814 is one of those stories that combines absurdity, quiet tragedy, and social commentary in a way that is almost perfectly suited for sleepy storytelling. No epic battles, no heroic deeds, just a wave of beer, some ruined homes, and a few bureaucratic headaches. And in its way, it is comforting. Life goes on. Beer is sticky. People adapt. London continues, as it always does, in damp gray rhythms that are oddly soothing if you let yourself float along with them. After the waters, or rather the beer, had receded, life in St. Giles returned to its usual slow rhythm. Residents patched up their homes, landlords grumbled quietly, and Moo and Company went back to producing porter as if nothing had happened. But of course, nothing really completely disappears. Some minor cultural ripples lingered, mostly in the form of prints, pamphlets, and whispered anecdotes in pubs. Satirical artists of the time found the beer flood an irresistible subject. Imagine it. Sober Londoners clinging to barrels, furniture floating along like tiny boats, and children cautiously stepping through sticky streets. These prints were meant to amuse, though in a polite, subdued way, and they circulated quietly among those who appreciated oddities. One can almost hear the curator of a gallery of 1810's prints whispering, and here we have the human struggle against fermented malt. Newspapers also mentioned the flood, though briefly. Articles would describe the extraordinary accident in formal tones, listing damages and fatalities with careful understatement. Some reports emphasized the economic side, how much beer was lost, how much money the brewery might have had to pay, but all of it was presented in that calm, bureaucratic style typical of the era. No dramatic headlines like we have today, just a slow, factual account. Over the years, the story of the beer flood became part of London's quirky historical memory. Guides to the city might mention it with a half smile. Historians would recount it as a minor industrial mishap, and locals would quietly nod at anyone who mentioned rivers of ale. It wasn't a tragedy that shaped policy, nor was it a scandal that toppled reputations. It was just something that happened, and that is, in its own sleepy way, oddly comforting. Moo and Company itself remained in business for decades. The brewery eventually merged with other companies, expanded its operations, and carried on making porter and later pale ales. The beer flood didn't ruin their reputation, though it became a curious footnote that could be mentioned in tours or lectures. Perhaps it even served as a reminder to future brewers to check the vats from time to time, though one suspects the allure of massive wooden barrels always outweighed caution. The story also underscores a quiet lesson about human life in industrial cities. Accidents happen. Sometimes they are dramatic, sometimes tragic, and sometimes they are simply absurd. The London beer flood combined a little of all three, though it leans heavily toward absurdity. People were inconvenienced, some lost lives, and some lost property, but in the grand, slow moving rhythm of London, it was just another blip. A sticky, foamy blip, but a blip nonetheless. In later years, historians and curious writers would point to the beer flood as an example of early industrial risks. Unlike the heroic stories of explorers or generals, this story is mundane, bureaucratic, and slow, perfectly suited for quiet reflection. One can imagine a sleepy narrator recounting it to an audience just before bedtime, the words rolling gently over listeners, like a sticky wave of ale. And in the end, that is why the London beer flood remains memorable, not because of grandeur or heroism, but because it is quietly strange. It reminds us that history is not just wars, kings, and revolutions. Sometimes it's about beer, wooden vats, and a neighborhood that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The flood didn't change the course of empires. It didn't make anyone famous, but it left a sticky imprint on London's collective memory, a story that can still make people pause, smile faintly, and imagine a river of porter flowing gently through cobblestone streets. So if you ever find yourself in London, wandering near St. Giles, you might imagine the streets as they were in 1814, damp, gray, ordinary, and for a brief, absurd moment, submerged in beer. And in that imagining, you can take comfort in the small, quiet absurdities of history. Life goes on. London continues. Beer flows occasionally, in stories if not in rivers. And humans, as always, adapt, repair, and move along at their unhurried pace, just like they did back then. In the softest sense, that is the legacy of the London beer flood of 1814, a wave of porter, a minor tragedy, and a reminder that even industrial accidents can be oddly poetic if you look at them slowly, without rushing. And with that, we drift to the end of this story, leaving behind foam, history, and the kind of quiet absurdity that makes for perfect sleepy narration.